The station hung in the dark like a jewel made of metal and fear. Conclave Prime was the largest structure ever built by the Galactic Council. It floated in orbit above the gas giant Verith 4, and it had seen hundreds of years of decisions that shaped the lives of billions of beings across the galaxy. Its halls were wide and cold, and always lit by a pale blue light that made every shadow look longer than it was. Today, those halls were full of noise. Delegates from 47 civilizations moved through the corridors in clusters. Some walked, some floated, some moved in ways that had no name in any human language. They wore the colors of their worlds, and they spoke in low and urgent tones, and every single one of them carried the same thing in their eyes: fear. Ambassador Thesavac of the Vreth walked slowly. He was old even by the standards of his people, and his 4 long arms moved with the careful grace of someone who had learned long ago that fast movements made other species nervous. He had spent 40 years in these halls. He had watched empires rise and fall. He had helped write 3 separate peace treaties that were still being honored to this day. He was not afraid. He was something worse than afraid. He was certain. The great chamber at the center of Conclave Prime could hold 10,000 delegates, and today it was nearly full. The ceiling above was a dome of transparent alloy, and through it the swirling orange and red storms of Verith 4 turned slowly like the eye of something ancient and uninterested. The delegates filled their seats, and the noise of 10,000 voices slowly dropped to silence as the Grand Arbiter took her place at the central podium. Her name was Varala, and she was of the Salenid people who had helped found the Council 300 years ago. She was tall and silver-skinned, and her voice when she spoke carried the kind of weight that came not from loudness but from absolute certainty. She said that the Council had gathered to discuss a matter of galactic security. She said the word security like it was a door she was closing. She pulled up a holographic display above the chamber floor, and the display showed a map of the galaxy with one section highlighted in gold. The gold section was growing. Varala spoke for a long time. She talked about the Terran Empire. She talked about how 300 years ago a small blue planet in an unremarkable star system had cracked the secret of faster-than-light travel and then done something no other species had done in quite the same way. They had not explored carefully. They had not sent slow probes and waited for generations to decide if a star system was safe. They had gone there, and then the next place, and then the one after that. 84 star systems now carried the flag of the Terran Empire. 84 worlds terraformed or settled or already alive with the noise of human cities. Human ships moved through hyperspace lanes with a speed and confidence that older civilizations still found unsettling. Human diplomats were charming and sharp and always seemed to know more than they should. Human soldiers had never lost a war. Not one. Varala let that last point sit in the air of the chamber for a moment, and the silence that followed it was the loudest silence Thesavac had ever heard. The debate that followed was not really a debate. It was the sound of fear wearing the costume of reason. Delegate after delegate stood and spoke about the danger of unchecked expansion. They spoke about balance and about the responsibility of powerful civilizations to submit to collective governance. They spoke about precedent and about the health of the galactic order. Thesavac listened to all of it and said nothing. He had read everything ever written about humanity. He had studied their history, their wars, their art, their philosophy. He had spent a full decade doing nothing but learning the way humans thought. He had read their old books and watched their old films and studied the speeches of their dead leaders, and somewhere in the middle of all that study he had come to understand something that the rest of the Council had never bothered to learn. Humans did not behave like other civilizations. Other civilizations, when they became powerful, became careful. They built slowly, they negotiated extensively, they asked permission, they joined councils and signed treaties and accepted limits because the weight of consequence made caution feel wise. Humans had learned different lessons. Their history was a long and brutal education in what happened when you trusted the powerful to protect the weak. They had been conquered and colonized and nearly destroyed by their own hands more than once, and every single time they had gotten back up, and the version of them that got up was always harder and smarter and less willing to bend. They did not ask permission. They built first and negotiated second, and if the negotiation failed, they were already ready for what came next. Varala called the vote. The Ultimatum Decree 7 Omega passed with 43 votes in favor and 4 abstentions. Thesavac was one of the 4 who abstained. He did not explain himself. He simply sat with his forearms folded and watched the display change as the vote was recorded. The terms of the decree were simple and total. The Terran Empire was to dissolve its military command structure and surrender all weapons rated above Class IV to Council oversight. It was to accept a Council-appointed governor for each of its 84 colonies and submit to the authority of the Galactic Council in all matters of foreign policy. It had 30 standard days to comply. If it did not comply, the Council would coordinate a full blockade of every Terran colony in the galaxy, cutting off trade, fuel, and communication until the Empire agreed to the terms. The decree was transmitted by tight beam relay to Terra Prime, the capital world of the Terran Empire. It would arrive in approximately 6 hours. The chamber broke into applause from many of the delegates. Some of them looked genuinely relieved. as if they had expected the vote to be harder. Varala accepted the congratulations of her colleagues with a dignified nod. Thesavac stood and walked out of the chamber without speaking to anyone. In the corridor outside he stopped and looked up through one of the wide observation windows at the storms of Verith, for he stood there for a long time with his oldest and most trusted assistant beside him. Her name was Pella, and she was young and still believed that the council usually made good decisions. She asked him what he thought would happen. Thesavac was quiet for a moment. He thought about every human document he had ever read. He thought about their history. He thought about the speech their first emperor had given when the Terran Empire was formally declared. He thought about the line in that speech that had stayed with him for 20 years, the line that said, "A free people do not ask the universe for permission to exist." He told Pella that he thought the council had just made the most expensive mistake in its 300-year history. She asked him what he meant. He did not answer. He walked back to his quarters and began packing the things he would need if he had to leave Conclave Prime quickly. He was methodical about it. He packed only what mattered. He left behind everything that could be replaced. He did not think there would be 30 days. He did not think there would be anywhere near 30 days. He had studied the humans long enough to know that when they were pushed, they did not push back slowly. They pushed back all at once, and they pushed back hard, and they did not stop until the thing pushing them was no longer capable of pushing anything. Outside the observation window, the storms of Verith turned and turned, and the stars beyond them were very still and very cold and completely indifferent to what any council anywhere had decided. The message arrived at Terra Prime at the exact moment Emperor Darian Solar 7 was watching a child explain fusion. The exhibition hall in the capital city of New Carthage was bright and loud and full of the energy that only children in large groups could produce. There were hundreds of young students from schools across the planet, and they had built things and designed things, and the hall smelled like hot circuits and fresh paint. Emperor Solus moved through the rows of display tables without a security formation because he had told his guards to stay back. He always did this at the children's exhibitions. He believed that children deserved to be spoken to by a person, not by an office. The girl at table 47 was 10 years old, and her name, according to the small card beside her display, was Inner Solar. She had built a miniature fusion coil out of parts she had ordered through a school supply program, and she explained how it worked with the calm confidence of someone who had practiced the explanation many times and believed every word of it. The Emperor listened to all of it. He asked her 2 questions. Both were real questions, not the kind adults asked children to make them feel heard. He genuinely wanted to know the answers. She gave them to him without hesitation. His personal communicator vibrated once. He excused himself politely and stepped to the edge of the room and read the message. He read it once. He did not read it again. He stood very still for exactly 4 seconds, and then he put the communicator back in his coat pocket and returned to Inner Solar's table and listened to the rest of her explanation. The aides who had been watching from a distance saw his face, and none of them could read it. That was the thing about Emperor Solus that made people around him either deeply reassured or deeply uneasy depending on who they were. He never showed alarm. He never showed panic. He had a stillness to him that was not the stillness of a man who did not feel things. It was the stillness of a man who had already decided what to do. He stayed at the exhibition for another 40 minutes. He spoke to 11 more children. He shook hands with 3 teachers. He thanked the organizers. He smiled for a photograph with a group of students who were clearly overwhelmed by the encounter. Then he got into his transport and told his driver to take him to the Imperial War Chamber. Admiral Yeva Oren received her summons while she was in the middle of a tactical simulation aboard the Fleet Command ship Sovereign's Edge. She had been running the simulation for 6 hours, and she was winning it the way she always won simulations, which was completely and without mercy. She was a compact woman with close-cropped grey hair and the kind of stillness in her eyes that matched the Emperor's, though hers came from a different place. His came from philosophy. Hers came from the fact that she had been in 3 actual wars and had never once made a decision she regretted. She arrived at the Imperial War Chamber before the Emperor did. The chamber was buried 6 levels below the Imperial Palace in a room that had no windows and no decorations and no furniture except a long table, a wall of displays and chairs that were designed for function, not comfort. When Emperor Solus walked in 12 minutes later, the full joint chiefs were already seated. He sat down. He put the communicator on the table. He said nothing for a moment. He looked at each of the 12 people in the room one at a time as if he was checking something about them. He apparently found what he was looking for because he nodded once. Then he told them what the council had sent. There was no outburst in the room. There were no raised voices. No one slammed a hand on the table. The Joint Chiefs of the Terran Empire were people who had been selected over the course of long careers precisely because they did not panic, and the Emperor had spent 20 years reinforcing the culture. They listened. They thought. They waited. General Harrow, who commanded the Imperial Ground Forces, asked how long the council had given them. 30 days, the Emperor said. There was a brief silence. Then the Emperor said they would need 4 Admiral Oren pulled up the strategic display on the wall, and the room filled with light maps of fleet positions, colony coordinates, council relay station locations, and supply chain data. She had been thinking about this kind of scenario for years, not because she was paranoid, but because that was her job, to think about threats before they arrived and to have answers ready when they did. What followed was not a meeting in the conventional sense, it was more like watching a machine. Come fully online, the Joint Chiefs moved through the strategic situation with the speed and precision of people who had rehearsed this exact category of problem in different forms for years. The Council's plan had three components. The blockade required coordination between fleets from multiple member species. That coordination required their relay station network to function. Those relay stations were located at fixed positions in space that were not secret. The blockade fleet would need 30 days to assemble and position itself, which meant for the first 4 days it was still in transit and vulnerable to disruption. The Council had also made an assumption so large and so obvious that it had apparently not noticed it was making it. It had assumed the Terran Empire would respond the way every other civilization had responded to a 7 Omega decree, which was to go quiet and argue and delay and eventually comply because the alternative seemed too large to face. Admiral Oren said the word assume very slowly and let it sit there. The Emperor almost smiled. The second thing the Joint Chiefs discussed was not military at all, it was political. Terran intelligence services had been monitoring the internal politics of Council member species for decades, not because the Empire was looking for enemies, but because knowledge was a form of armor, and the Empire wore as much armor as it could find. 3 species within the Council had been quietly unhappy with Council governance for a long time. The Orith Compact had been blocked from expanding their trade routes by Council regulations that seemed designed to benefit older members. The Selene Republics had lost a border arbitration in a way that many of their citizens considered deeply unfair. The Duvhari hegemony had been asking for a seat on the Council's inner governing board for 60 years and kept being told the time was not right. These were not secrets. The Council knew about all of this unhappiness and had decided it did not matter because unhappy members still voted with the group when the pressure was high enough. The Empire's diplomatic corps had a different assessment. The corps had been quietly building relationships with officials in all three civilizations for years, not offering deals, not making promises, just building the kind of slow, careful trust that paid off in moments exactly like this one. They were given authorization that evening to activate those relationships. By the time the meeting ended, the room had a plan that was specific and sequenced and required no dramatic gestures and no declarations of war. It required speed and silence, and the kind of total coordination that only came from years of building a military culture around the idea that the first minutes of any conflict determined everything that came after. The Emperor stood and the Joint Chiefs stood with him. He said one thing before he left the room. He said that the Council had spent 300 years watching civilizations accept limits because they were afraid of what happened if they did not. He said the Council had never once encountered a civilization that had looked at those limits and decided they were not real. He said the Terran Empire was going to show the galaxy what it looked like when a people remembered that limits were only real if you believed in them. Then he walked out and the war chamber came fully and quietly alive behind him. Outside in the corridors of the palace, life continued normally. Citizens walked streets and ate meals and put their children to bed, and none of them knew yet what had been decided in the room below the ground, but the Empire was already moving, and it moved the way it always moved when it was serious. Without noise, without announcement, without hesitation. And very, very fast. On the first day, nothing appeared to happen. That was the point. While the Galactic Council waited for humanity to respond with panic or anger or desperate negotiation, the Terran Empire was already working. Admiral Oren had divided her fleet commanders into 3 groups and given each group a set of targets and a time window and a single instruction: do not fire unless fired upon first. The weapons were loaded. The ships were in position, but nobody watching from the outside would have seen anything unusual. A Terran trade convoy, here a science vessel rerouting, there a supply ship that was slightly off its normal lane. The Council's relay network was the spine of its communication system. 14 stations positioned across the galaxy allowed the Council to coordinate its member fleets in real time. Without those stations, the left hand of the Council could not talk to the right hand. Each station was lightly defended because the Council had never had a reason to defend them heavily. No one had ever threatened them before. At exactly the same moment, across 14 different star systems, Terran ships that had been drifting casually in nearby space for weeks activated their engines and moved. They did not destroy the stations. They did not need to. Each station had 2 things it needed to function: a power receiver that pulled energy from nearby stellar sources and a communication array that sent and received signals. The Terran ships deployed what Admiral Oren called signal shrouds, large deployable structures made of a composite material that absorbed and scattered certain frequencies of energy. They wrapped around each station like a quiet hand covering a mouth. The stations were not broken, they were simply unable to talk to anyone. The whole operation took 11 minutes. On Conclave Prime Grand Arbiter. Varala was in the middle of a morning briefing when her communications officer told her that relay stations 7 through 20 were not responding. She asked what that meant. He told her it meant the Council could no longer communicate securely with the fleets it had ordered to begin moving toward Terran space. She asked how long it would take to fix. He told her he did not know because he did not understand what had been done to the stations yet. Varala stood very still for a moment, and then she asked someone to find Ambassador Thesavac. Thesavac was already gone. He had left Conclave Prime 6 hours earlier on a small private transport. He had filed a routine travel request and no one had thought to question it. He was currently traveling at speed toward a destination that he had not listed in the official record. On the second day, the fractures opened. The Terran diplomatic corps had spent years building quiet trust with officials in the Orith Compact, the Selene Republics, and the Duvhari hegemony, and on the second day of Operation Holocrown, every one of those relationships was activated at once. The conversations were different in each case, but they shared a common shape. The Terran diplomats did not beg, they did not offer bribes, they simply laid out two things very clearly. The first thing was evidence of how Council governance had specifically and deliberately disadvantaged each of these three civilizations over decades, evidence that was documented and verifiable, and in some cases came from Council internal records that the Terrans had obtained through means they did not explain. The second thing was an invitation. The Terran Empire was not asking these civilizations to fight. The Empire was asking them to simply tell the truth publicly, to say out loud what they had been saying in private for years. The Orith Compact made its announcement first. It said it was withdrawing its support from Decree 7 Omega on the grounds that the decree had been passed without proper consultation of all member voices. It said the Council had a long history of using collective security language to enforce the preferences of its founding members at the expense of newer ones. The Selene Republics followed 6 hours later with a statement that was longer and angrier and cited specific cases going back 40 years. The Duvhari hegemony waited until both of those statements had spread across the galactic communication networks, and then released a document that was not a statement but a record 300 pages of internal Council correspondence showing that the hegemony's application for an inner board seat had been deliberately buried by 3 founding Council members who had decided privately that no new species should ever join the inner board regardless of their qualifications. The Council's public response was outrage, but outrage was not the same as unity, and for the first time in its history, the Council looked less like a governing body and more like what it actually was, a group of powerful civilizations who had agreed to cooperate as long as cooperation served the most powerful ones. On the third day, the blockade fleet arrived. It was an impressive force by any measure, warships from 9 different Council member species moving in coordinated formation toward the edge of Terran space. The fleet commanders had received their orders late because of the relay station problem, and they had been traveling fast to make up time. They expected to find a border. They expected perhaps some Terran patrol ships. They expected the opening of a tense standoff that would last weeks until the humans folded. What they found instead stopped them cold. The asteroid belts along the border of Terran space were not empty. For decades, while the Council had been monitoring Terran military ship counts and weapon inventories and fleet movements, it had not been monitoring construction inside asteroid belts, inside gas giant atmospheres, inside the dark spaces between moons where sensors rarely pointed. The Terrans had not been hiding aggression, they had been hiding readiness. Defense platforms emerged from the rock and the dark in numbers that did not match any intelligence estimate. The fleet commanders had been told to expect light border defenses. They were looking at something that was not light and was not defensive in the way they had imagined it was defensive, the way a wall was defensive, a complete enclosing structure with no gaps. The Terran ships that appeared around the platforms were not the patrol vessels the Council commanders had expected either. They were heavy fleet ships, fast and built for endurance, and carrying weapons that the intelligence reports had said the Terrans would need to surrender. The intelligence reports had been looking at the wrong inventory. A Terran fleet coordinator opened a channel to the Council commanders and spoke. In a polite and unhurried tone, she told them that their ships were welcome to remain where they were. She told them that no one would fire first. She told them that the Terran Empire had no desire for a battle. She told them to sit and wait because something was coming that would make a battle completely unnecessary. The Council fleet commanders looked at the walls of platforms around them and then looked at each other across their own communication channels, and none of them said what they were all thinking, which was that they had not surrounded the Terran Empire. The Terran Empire had surrounded them. On the 4th day, the Emperor spoke. He did not broadcast to the galaxy with dramatic music or lighting. He sat at a plain desk in a plain room and he spoke to a camera, and his voice was calm and his words were simple. He said the Galactic Council had issued an ultimatum and that the Empire had considered it carefully. Then he released the document. It was long, it was detailed, it was footnoted and sourced and cross-referenced, and it covered 300 years of Council history. It named specific decisions that had resulted in the suppression of emerging civilizations. It showed evidence of wars the Council had quietly engineered between smaller species to keep them from growing powerful enough to challenge its authority. It showed trade agreements written in language that appeared fair but was specifically structured to prevent certain civilizations from ever developing independent economic strength. He offered the Council a choice: reform into something that actually served the galaxy or become irrelevant, while the galaxy built something else without them. He gave them 14 days to decide. And then he turned off the camera and went back to work. Corporal Maya Dresch had been stationed at Border Post 11 for 3 weeks before the blockade fleet arrived. She was 22 years old, and she had grown up in a small city on the colony world of Redmarch, which was the 41st world the Empire had settled, and was still covered mostly in orange grass that moved like water in the wind. She had joined the military because she believed in what the Empire was doing, not in the way that people believed in things they had been told to believe, but in the way that people believed in things they had seen with their own eyes. She had seen what the Empire built. She had seen schools and hospitals and communication networks go up on worlds that had been empty rock 2 generations ago. She had seen the care that went into it, and she had decided she wanted to be part of it. Border Post 11 was a series of connected habitat modules anchored to an asteroid, and it was not a comfortable place to be stationed, but Maya did not mind that she had a small bunk and a good view of space, and the people she served with were sharp and competent, and she trusted them. When the Council blockade fleet appeared on the long-range sensors, nobody at Border Post 11 panicked because they had been told this was coming, and they had been told what to do about it, which was nothing except watch and wait and not fire unless something fired at them first. What nobody had briefed Maya on was the possibility that a single small craft from the blockade fleet would break formation and drift close enough to the post to trigger a docking alarm, and that the craft would contain a single crew member who was not trying to attack anything but was simply lost. His name in Orith was something that sounded like wind through a pipe, and Maya eventually started calling him Pip, which he did not seem to mind. He was young by Orith standards, which meant he was approximately 40 years old, and he had the large pale eyes of his species and the nervous energy of someone who had made a mistake and was not sure how bad the consequences were going to be. His navigation system had failed, his ship had drifted, he had seen the post and made the decision to dock rather than float in empty space and hope someone found him before his life support ran low. Maya was the one who met him at the airlock. She was also the one who made the decision 20 minutes later to share her ration pack with him because he had not eaten in 14 hours, and hungry guests, regardless of what flag their fleet was flying under, were still guests, and she had been raised in a culture that believed feeding people was not a political act, it was just a basic human thing to do. They sat in the small common room of the post and ate and communicated through a translation device, and Maya learned that Pip had not wanted to be part of the blockade fleet he had been assigned. He was a navigator on a supply vessel, not a warship, and his captain had received orders and followed them, and Pip had gone along because that was what you did when you were crew. She asked him what he thought of the humans. He was quiet for a moment. He said that his people had been told the humans were dangerous and expanding too fast and needed to be contained. He said that was what the Council said. He said that sitting in this room eating food that a human soldier had shared with him without being asked, he was not sure what to think. Maya told him that was fair. She told him something else too. She told him that the humans were not expanding because they were greedy, they were expanding because they remembered what happened to people who had nowhere to go. She told him about Earth's history. She told it in brief, simple terms, but she told the real version, not the polished one, the wars, the near extinctions, the times when whole populations had been at the mercy of powers that did not care whether they lived or died. She said that the Empire was not built to take things from other people, it was built so that humans would never again be in a position where someone else could decide their fate for them. Pip was quiet for a long time after that. He said that the Orith had their own version of that story. He said there were things in their history that the Council's version of events had smoothed over and made neat that were not actually neat at all. They talked for 6 hours. Meanwhile, Ambassador Thesavac was sitting across a table from Empress Solis in a small room in the Imperial Palace on Terra Prime. Thesavac had requested the meeting, and the Emperor had granted it within hours, which told Thesavac something. He had not been sure the Emperor would see him. He was a Council ambassador, even if he had abstained from the vote, and he had expected at minimum a waiting period that communicated the Empire's displeasure. Instead, he had been brought directly in. The Emperor looked at him with eyes that were calm and interested, and Thesavac found himself thinking about all the years he had spent studying the species, and how they still found ways to be different from what he expected. He told the Emperor that he had not voted for the decree. The Emperor said he knew. Thesavac asked how. The Emperor said that the Empire had been watching the Council's internal politics for a long time, and that Thesavac's abstention had not been a surprise because his research into human history and culture had been flagged in Terran intelligence reports years ago. He said that any scholar who spent 40 years learning to understand a people rather than fear them was worth paying attention to. Thesavac asked the Emperor what he wanted. The emperor said he wanted the same thing he had always wanted. He said the empire had never set out to dominate anyone. He said the goal had always been security, real security, not the kind that depended on the goodwill of more powerful neighbors, but the kind that came from being strong enough that goodwill was offered freely. Rather than extracted, he said that when you were strong enough, nobody tried to manage you, and when nobody tried to manage you, you could actually choose how to behave. He said the empire had chosen. Thesevac thought about that for a long time. He thought about the council and its 300 years of decisions. He thought about how many of those decisions had been framed as collective security, and how many of them had actually been the preferences of the strong wearing the costume of the common good. He thought about a young human corporal somewhere on a border post, probably sharing her food with someone who was technically on the other side of this standoff because that was apparently just what humans did. He asked the emperor one question. He asked whether humanity had ever considered that its strength might frighten people who were not its enemies. The emperor said yes. He said it was a problem he thought about often. He said the solution was not to become weaker, but to become trustworthy, and that those were very different things. He said you could not make yourself safe by being small. You could only make yourself trusted by being consistent, and consistent meant showing the galaxy over and over through action, not words, that the empire's strength was not a threat to those who did not threaten it. When Thesevac left the palace 6 hours later, his assistant Pella was waiting outside. And she saw immediately that he had been crying. She did not ask why, because she had learned in her years working with him that some things were better understood slowly. He looked up at the Terra Prime sky, which was a deep and vivid blue, and he said quietly that he had spent 40 years studying the humans and he was still not done. He said it like it was the best possible news. The council's formal withdrawal of Decree 7 Omega was not announced with ceremony. There was no broadcast, no gathering of delegates, no carefully worded statement delivered from a podium in the great chamber of Conclave Prime. There was a document filed through official channels on a quiet morning, and it said in the dry language of bureaucratic record that the council had determined that Decree 7 Omega had been issued without adequate review of all relevant political factors, and was therefore being withdrawn pending a full restructuring of council decision-making procedures. What it did not say was that 3 founding members of the council's inner governing board had resigned in the previous 48 hours. What it did not say was that Grand Arbiter Varala had spent 6 consecutive days in closed meetings trying to hold together a coalition that was coming apart at every seam. What it did not say was that 12 more council member species had quietly reached out to Terran diplomatic channels asking what the Empire's plans were and whether there was something they could be part of. The Galactic Council had been the authority in this part of the galaxy for 300 years, and in the space of 4 days it had gone from issuing an ultimatum to a single empire to not being entirely sure what it was anymore. On Conclave Prime, the corridors were quieter than they had been in living memory. The blockade fleet was told to stand down. This message reached the fleet commanders through a backup communication channel because the primary relay network was still wrapped in Terran signal shrouds. The fleet commanders passed the order down their chains of command, and the ships began the slow process of turning around and heading back to their home systems. It was a long, quiet journey, and many of the crew members spent it thinking about things they had not thought about before. The Terran ships watching the blockade fleet leave did not follow them. They did not hail them or demonstrate or make any show of the fact that they had been sitting in formation around the council fleet for 4 days. They simply watched, and when the last council ship had cleared the boundary, they went back to their regular patrol patterns as if nothing unusual had happened. On Border Post 11, Pip's navigation system was repaired by a Terran technician who spent 2 hours on the job and refused any form of payment. He shook Pip's hand at the airlock with a grip that surprised Pip because humans were physically stronger than they looked, and Pip flew back to his ship and rejoined what was left of the fleet formation. Before he left, he sent a short message to Maya Dresch. It said thank you for the food. It said he was going to ask questions when he got home. It said he hoped they would meet again under circumstances that required less confusion to get to the meeting. Maya read it 3 times and then pinned it to the small board above her bunk next to a photograph of the orange grass plains of Red March. The Concord of New Worlds was announced 31 days after the withdrawal of Decree 7 Omega. The announcement came not from the Terran Empire alone, but from a joint statement signed by representatives of the Terran Empire, the Orith Compact, the Selene Republics, the Duvhari Hegemony, and 9 other civilizations that had decided the time was right to attach their names to something new. The Concord was not a replacement for the Council, not immediately. It was a parallel body with different principles. Its charter was short and written in plain language that any literate being could understand in an afternoon. It said that all civilizations had the right to grow and trade and govern themselves without interference from more powerful neighbors. It said that collective security was only legitimate when it actually served the collective and not just the most established members. It said that any civilization that was being suppressed by the existing order had the right to petition for review, and that review would be conducted by a board made up of species who had no stake in the outcome. It said that the use of collective force against a civilization simply because that civilization had become powerful was not security, it was fear, and fear was not a foundation for anything that lasted. The Terran Empire agreed to limit its military expansion for a period of 50 years in exchange for guaranteed equal representation in all Concord governance. This was a significant concession, and the Emperor's critic said so loudly he responded that strength was only useful if it was trusted, and trust was only built through consistent behavior over time, and 50 years was a reasonable amount of time to demonstrate consistency. Ambassador Thesevac was asked to deliver the opening address at the Concord's first formal session. He stood at the podium and looked out at the assembled representatives of 14 civilizations, and he thought about how different this room felt from the great chamber of Conclave Prime. It was smaller, and the ceiling was not a dome, and there was no gas giant turning slowly overhead. There was just a room and people in it, and the particular kind of possibility that lived in rooms like this at moments like this. He had prepared a long speech. He did not give it. He said only that he had spent 40 years studying the humans, and that in 40 years he had learned one thing above all others. He said that the humans were not the most advanced civilization in the galaxy. They were not the oldest, they were not the most peaceful, and they were certainly not the most cautious. He said what they were was consistent. He said that every other civilization he had studied had a point at which they stopped when they reached a certain size or a certain power. They found reasons to slow down, to consolidate, to accept the shape of things as they were. Humans did not have that point. They kept going, not out of greed, but out of something harder to name, a refusal to accept that the way things were was the way things had to be. He said that was frightening if you were trying to maintain an existing order. He said it was extraordinary if you were trying to build a new one. He stepped back from the podium and the room was quiet for a moment, and then it was not. On Terra Prime that same day, in the bright exhibition hall of New Carthage, a girl named Inasola was no longer 10 years old. She was 11, and she was now in the first year of an engineering cadet program that the Empire ran for young students who had shown exceptional aptitude. She was sitting at a workbench in a room full of other students who were all working on their own projects, and she was designing something. It was not a miniature fusion coil this time. It was larger and more complicated, and the specifications she was working from were one she had written herself in a notebook she kept beside her bed. She had been working on the design for 6 months, and she was not done yet, but she could see the shape of what it would become, and that shape was good. Outside the workbench window, the city of New Carthage moved through its day ships, crossed the sky on their way to and from the orbital transit hub. Citizens walked streets lined with trees that had been planted 40 years ago by people who would never see them. Full-grown schools and hospitals and markets and libraries, all the ordinary structures of a civilization that was still figuring itself out, still growing, still choosing every day what kind of thing it wanted to be. The galaxy had issued an ultimatum to these people. These people had looked at it and decided what it would mean, and then gone ahead and meant it. Somewhere at the edge of Terran space, the stars were very still, and the dark between them was full of the movement of ships carrying people and supplies and ideas from one world to another. And the movement did not stop and had no intention of stopping, because that was what it was to be alive and free and unafraid, and pointed always toward what came next.